I've worked out here at the Honest Land Village site for the past 6 summers, and throughout those years a handful of tourists have asked me, are the Mandan Welsh? Did the Vikings help the Mandan build these earth lodges? Well, in order to set the record straight, I intend to illustrate how these Welsh and Viking theories are simply fiction. My name is Johan, and welcome to today's episode of Discovering Fort Abraham Lincoln. Legend has it that in the year 1170, Prince Madoc of Wales sailed west in order to avoid warfare in his home country. The death of his father had ignited a conflict among his many children who were fighting for ownership of the Welsh throne. But Prince Madoc, wanting nothing to do with the conflict, took a voyage across the Atlantic, landing on the North American continent 300 years before Christopher Columbus. Now, whether that legend is true and whether Prince Madoc ever really made it to North America, no one knows for sure. But the persistent theory that the Mandan are in some way descended from Prince Madoc or are descended from the Welsh is founded on nothing but flimsy evidence and hearsay. European traders and explorers at the time and firm believers of the Welsh theory have pushed the notion that there were Mandan who were white, blonde-haired, and even blue-eyed. But consistently, when you look at the evidence, linguistically, genetically, or just simply logically, over and over again, the evidence disproves the Welsh theory. Let's take a look at the linguistic evidence first. Mandan and Welsh are completely different languages, as they're derived from 2 different language families, Welsh being an Indo-European language, and Mandan being a Siouan language. Additionally, Welsh has about twice as many consonant and vowel sounds as the Mandan language has. And then when you look at the sentence structure and the grammar of the 2 languages, you see that they're strikingly different. But despite the languages clearly being unrelated, there was one man who was determined to find a similarity between the 2, George Catlin. Now, George Catlin was an American painter who traveled the great North American continent in the 1830s, making it his mission to paint what he believed was the disappearing cultures of the native West. However, Catlin was a firm believer in the Welsh theory. So in his writings describing his journey, he produced a chart comparing 11 Mandan words to 11 Welsh words. Unfortunately, Catlin wasn't fluent in neither Welsh nor Mandan, so he produced a chart full of errors. And according to an article entitled "That Mandan is Not Welsh," which is a contemporary examination of Catlin's chart by a Welsh speaker and linguist in collaboration with a Mandan learner. So in this examination, they found that only one of the words Catlin used could arguably is seen to be similar. But then the article goes on further to make an interesting point that the English word for 2 and many is practically identical to the Korean word for 2 and many. But that does not mean that Korea colonized England in the distant past. After having briefly analyzed these 2 languages, let's take a look at what limited genetic evidence exists. Notably, George Catlin himself, the aforementioned George Catlin, wrote that, quote, 1/5 of the tribe's complexions were nearly white, with hair of a silvery gray from childhood to old age, and their eyes light blue, end quote. So although Catlin's writings were consistently slanted in favor of his Welsh theory, like I said, he wasn't the only visitor to make these observations. So are these reports proof of the Mandan's European heritage? No. The Mandan certainly did have a lighter skin, but that wasn't particularly unique. The Hidatsa, the Cree, the Crow, and a few other tribes were reported to have light skin as well. And it's not that surprising when you consider that the Mandan lived in earth lodges, well-insulated earth lodges, and they lived in a land known for its long and enduring winters. So it's not a big shock that they had a slightly lighter skin tone than many of the other Native Americans across the vast North American continent. Then how do you explain reports of blonde hair and blue eyes? Well, the unique phenomenon of premature gray and white hair observed in the Mandan at this time was most likely what European visitors were actually observing when they wrote down reports of blonde hair. And additionally, it's important to note that when explorers like George Catlin were interacting with the Mandan had already been interacting with Europeans for over 100 years. So any blue eyes that perhaps were observed were much more likely a result of 18th and 19th century whites than a small legendary Welsh colony from 600 years ago. And then there's another incredibly compelling reason to be skeptical of this blue eye connection. And the website nativelanguages.org gives it a very articulate reason for why you should be skeptical in an article entitled "Setting the Record Straight About Native Peoples, Norse and Welsh Explorers." And in this article, they point out that, quote, "Blue eyes, like blonde hair, is genetically recessive. So if a full-blood Indian and a blue-eyed Caucasian person had a baby, it would be genetically impossible for that baby to have blue eyes. Blue eyes only occur in people who have blue-eyed Caucasian relatives on both sides of their family tree. And even then, only some of the time." End quote. So, that means that in order for a small Welsh colony to retain or transfer any unique European traits, it would have required an unbelievable amount of inbreeding for hundreds of years. Simply put, the Mandan were not Welsh. What they were is this: the Mandan were successful farmers, impressive architects, incredibly intelligent, and friendly to whites. And all of these things combined, they did not fit into the stereotype of what a Native American was at the time. So many rationalized that tribes like the Mandan weren't true Native Americans. They couldn't be, with all of these successes and advancements. Thankfully today, no serious scholar believes the Welsh theory, as it is pursued almost solely by amateur YouTube and pseudo-historians. And with that being said, to answer your first question, are the Mandan descended from the Welsh? No. And as for your second question, did the Vikings help the Mandan build these earth lodges? I assure you the answer is no as well, but unfortunately I do not have time to get into the Viking theory today, so I'll leave it there. Thank you for joining me for today's episode of Discovering Fort Abraham Lincoln. I hope to see you again soon.